Okay, I'm going to begin first by asking your opinion on something. It's not to trick you or anything. I just want you to respond as you feel your conviction. Here's a situation. Debbie and I have made a plan to go out to dinner and then a movie. I get caught up in things at work. I come home an hour late, and Debbie's upset a bit because we have to change our plans because we can't do what we plan to do in the time that's left. So I apologize. And in response to that, she says, I forgive you, but please don't do it again. And if something comes up, just call and let me know. Now, who among you thinks that's an appropriate response of forgiveness to what happened? Okay. Yeah, some people are saying they would be more upset, and stuff like that. Okay, here's another situation. Recently in California, a family was found to have confined 13 of their children in the house under horrific circumstances. They had no social life. They were poorly fed. They were prisoners in their own home. And imagine that these parents are before a judge and they say, we apologize. We're really sorry we did that. If the judge replied to them, okay, I forgive you. Please don't do that again. Who thinks that's an appropriate response? Okay? We have an inner sense that they're different, that there's something vastly different. In one case, the response is just and normal. It's what mature people do. In the other case, if we did that, it'd be a travesty of justice because people's lives aren't being valued there. There must be justice done. There must be a payment. It's too big to ignore. We naturally know that sometimes forgiveness is more clear-cut and easy than at other times. Sometimes you just can't say, oh, I forgive you. Because justice must be served, and a debt must be paid. And that's because there is a cost to forgiveness. There's a cost to forgiveness. We talk about our debt and our obligation to forgive each other, and that's good because the Bible talks about that a whole lot. We are to forgive each other, but sometimes we act like we can forgive without there being a cost. We draw up this picture that somehow we just make an internal decision to forgive someone, and we say to them, I forgive you, and we become free, they become free, and that's the end of that. But we don't think about the cost of that forgiveness. But there is a cost. It's easiest to see when the sin against us, when the infraction has some kind of financial value. Imagine that you lend your laptop to your brother, and he spills a Coke on it, and it's destroyed. Now, whenever we have that happen to us, we have two basic choices. We can forgive, or we can make them pay. Now, if we forgive, then we bear the emotional cost of the loss. We pay the price internally to lay it aside, and then on top of it, we pay a financial cost of buying the new laptop or the difficulty of living without it. Somebody's paying a cost. Now, if we decide to make him pay, then first of all, we want to hurt him emotionally. And that's where all the yelling and drama comes up. Instead of saying, oh, you broke it, you need to pay for it. No, there's going to be some histrionics. There's going to be some yelling. Make them pay. And then we're looking for them to financially replace the laptop. Even if there's no material loss, even if it's just an emotional moment, someone has to pay the cost of a hurtful behavior. It's either the offender or the one offended. But someone pays the cost. That's a fact. We're in week 2 of our series, Why the Cross? And last week we talked about the reality of sin, the bent inside of us towards selfishness and godlessness. And it's a bent, it's a direction that permeates the whole world. This week we're looking more at the results of that, the actions, the sins, plural. And we're looking at the cost of that. Using Romans chapter 5, verses 6 to 11, we're going to see that the cross is where the cost of forgiveness has been paid. On the cross, we are reconciled to God. On the cross, we are redeemed. On the cross, the price is paid. At the cross, we are released from our debt, and it's a debt we couldn't have possibly paid ourselves. So let's take a look at it now. Chapter 5 of the book of Romans, we'll begin at verse 6. You see, just at the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? For if, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? Not only is this so, but we also boast in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation. If we're going to be talking about the forgiveness of God and the cost of that forgiveness, we have to first talk about the justice of God. And talking about the fact that God is angry at sin sometimes makes us uncomfortable. Now, we teach that God holds us accountable for our actions and judges sin. But to some of us, that just doesn't seem very mature. You know, why is God holding a grudge? Why doesn't he just put it aside? That's what mature people do. Well, since this is a series on the cross, we do know that God finds a way to be just and to forgive. But that forgiveness has a cost, because there is always a cost to forgiveness. We act as if God is angry about sin because of some insecurity that he has inside. It's as if God's thinking that, well, people haven't honored me enough. Don't we know that I'm boss? If we think that way at all, then that's the wrong way entirely to think about God's attitude towards sin. We need to begin to understand the justice of God by understanding that some things are of enough value that they deserve, even demand, protection. If I have a disposable pen and someone takes it, I don't give it a second thought. If someone breaks my computer, then I'm going to probably look for some help from them to get it restored. If someone hurts my grandchild, if there's anything at all deliberate about it, I want the full weight of justice to come upon their lives. We need to understand that God's justice is the passionate protection of something of incredible value. The justice of God is the passionate protection of something of incredible value. Sin hurts us, and we have value. It damages and destroys the creation around it. It damages and destroys other people. That has value in God's sight. We destroy our relationship with God. That has value, and God will defend it. So God's insistence on justice means he will not overlook harming someone or something of great value. He will hold the person accountable. Our own internal sense of justice resonates with that. If someone steals our pen, we get over it. If someone abuses a child, a price must be paid. That child is too valuable to just write it off by saying, "Oh, you're forgiven, please don't do it again." No, we have a whole system. There are policemen, courtrooms, trials, prisons, parole boards, a whole host of ways to execute justice and try to control the damage and protect what's valuable. And that's what the justice of God, that's what the wrath of God is like. God fiercely loves and protects his good creation. And he will hold accountable those who break, misuse, and destroy the world that he loves. And that includes us. So if God's going to deal with our sin and make forgiveness possible, somebody has to pay the cost. Jesus pays the cost. Somebody has to make it right. Somebody has to pay for the broken computer. Somebody has to bear the consequences of hurting a human being. And that leads us to the cross. Because it's at the cross where God pays the cost of forgiveness for the disrespect and damage done by our sin. And he does it for the whole world. As it says in what we just read in Romans, you see, at just the right time, while we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, although for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Christ died for us. He pays the cost of forgiveness. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment with me. When Jesus goes into the garden the night before he died, the Gospel of Matthew tells us that he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Some translations say that he was deeply distressed. The picture the Gospel gives us here is Jesus reeling. He's almost dumbfounded. He's astonished. He's on the way to the cross. He's on the way into the garden, and all of a sudden there's this sense that something's revealed to him, and a darkness and horror comes over him that's more than it seems like he could have anticipated. Now, author and pastor Tim Keller, in his book Encounters with Jesus, Tim Keller reminds us that these Gospels were written 30 years or more after Jesus died on the cross. In that time, Stephen has died a martyr's death. And it says in the book of Acts that Stephen, as he faced the people ready to kill him, his face was radiant like the face of an angel. Already, the gospel writers knew that followers of Jesus were facing death with a peace and a serenity and a wholeness that was just unaccounted for. The testimony of the church goes on for centuries of Christians going to the lions' dens, to the lions out in the Colosseum with hymns on their lips. That they go into the flames with their hands raised in praise. They go with poise and serenity. But Jesus is facing his death in a way his followers didn't. His face is not radiant like an angel. You can look in all four Gospels. He's not calm and poised. It talks about him being deeply distressed. It talks about his sweat pouring off his body like blood. And certainly this must have happened, or the gospel writers would have never told us that Jesus is struggling more than his followers did in facing death. We would have a story of a radiant Jesus facing the cross in absolute triumph. But instead, we have him on his knees. We have him crying out to God, my God, take this cup, please, from me. So what's the reason then for the horror that's on Jesus that's not on his followers? And the answer is the death he faced was different than the death that anybody has faced before or since. In the same Gospel of Matthew, Jesus prays what I just said, my Father, if it's possible, may this cup be taken away from me, yet not as I will, but your will. In the Bible, the cup refers to God's own wrath. It's God's wrath against injustice and evil doing. In Ezekiel 23, it says, you will drink the cup of ruin and desolation. In Isaiah 51, it speaks of those who drink the cup of God's wrath, the bowl of staggering. So the reason Jesus didn't die as gracefully as his followers is because none of them were facing the cup. When Jesus himself speaks of the cup, it shows that he's not facing just the physical pain and shame of the cross, but he's about to experience the full divine wrath on the evil and sin of the world. The judicial wrath of God is about to come upon him instead of us. This is the cost of forgiveness. But what does that wrath look like? The essence of sin is that I don't want God in my life. And the essence of God's wrath against sin is to give us what we asked for. As C.S. Lewis says in The Great Divorce, if in this life you never say to God, thy will be done, then eventually God will say to you in the afterlife, all right then, thy will be done. So if you want freedom from God and a godless life, you will justly get what you hope for. A life without God. And that's hell. And Jesus took that punishment, that suffering, that hell upon himself. Think of the cost. The one who had perfect fellowship with God, the one who knew the exquisite pleasure of communion within the Godhead, the one who knew what full communion between God and humanity was supposed to be like, and experienced that for the first time in his eternal experience. He is going to find that line of communication and love and fellowship severed. What Jesus fears is not the cross, but the cup. He fears the looming prospect of separation from God. The separation from God that is the consequence of our rebellion, our godlessness, and our sin. So this is what forgiveness costs. This is what Jesus paid to reconcile us to God. Keller also points out to us that God always says in one way or another, obey me and I will bless you and be with you. The promise of blessing and communion. Only once has he said something different to a human being. in what he said to Jesus. To the first Adam in the Garden of Eden, he says, "Obey me about the tree of life, and I will bless you." That's essentially what goes on in Genesis 1 and 2. But Adam disobeys. Then God comes to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he says, in effect, "Obey me about the tree of death, and I will crush you." And Jesus still obeys. He obeys. He pays the cost of forgiveness. Jesus fully loves God no matter what the cost. Jesus fully loves humanity no matter what the cost. Jesus alone fulfills the law of loving God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving our neighbor as ourselves. Jesus alone does it perfectly. And so, with that perfect obedience, the perfect human loves us and gives himself for us. And he does that, as Romans tells us, while we were still enemies. And in the mighty way that only God can do, Jesus is expressing God's own love for us, and in one moment is satisfying his justice, and at the same moment providing a way of release, reconciliation, and forgiveness. As the Romans passage tells us. You see, at just the right time, while we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So let's just take a moment to look at the second half of today's passage, particularly verse 10. Verse 10 says this: "For if while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life?" While we were God's enemies, Christ died for us. So if we respond to this offer of forgiveness, how much more will God's forgiveness and power and presence be available to us in our lives? Today, now, despite all the problems that we bring. How much more, if we were openly enemies and he did this, how much more, if we believe and respond, will he be present even now? So you might be thinking, I can't follow Jesus because I know I can't keep it up. God will get tired of my failures. But look at the passage. While you were an enemy, hostile and godless, Christ faced the cross for you. He took the cup. He paid the cost of forgiveness. And if that cup didn't make him give up on us, then nothing will. Nothing you have done is outside the cup. All the hurts and anger that you carry around about how the world has hurt you and all of the guilt for that, that's in the cup. Jesus has paid it in full. This is the love you have been longing for all your life. This is the love that in advance paid the cost for forgiveness. This is the only love that can't let you down. This is bomb-proof love. This is life-changing, world-changing love. This love is forever. This love cannot fail. And this love is so deep, wide, and high that God has to actually give you power to even begin to understand it. And this love is for you. It has your name on it. Verse 8 of our passage today. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Let's pray.